Such a rainy, stormy night. I didn't expect to see anybody here. So it's good to see you. If for no other reason, you get out of the rain. Well, let's dive into what I've been avoiding, and you might be avoiding. This is a very difficult passage tonight in the text. We're on page 95 in the direct and gradual section, dealing with a Bhikshu Zhi Cheng. And just to bring up to speed, everybody remembers he was the one that was hired to assassinate the Sixth Patriarch, failed in his mission, but was transformed by the experience of that, touched by the compassion and kindness of the Master, left in order to avoid getting the wrath of the Master's disciples, then cultivated on his own, ordained and became a Buddhist monk, and then, as requested, returned to visit Hui Neng, the Sixth Patriarch, later, and certainly he was not even noticed probably when he came in because his appearance had changed so drastically from when he was the hired assassin to a cultivating Buddhist monk. And apparently he had been cultivating austerities, asceticism. And so in many ways his demeanor and deportment would have been radically different. He would have, his weight would be different. His baby fat would be gone if he had any. Even his musculature would have changed, because when you're really cultivating this type of practice, all those hard muscles and that whole physique has to soften and let go in order to let the mind and body relax so that you can break the attachments that prevent awakening. So in many ways, you just imagine he was probably unrecognizable from his former state. And inside as well. It seems as if the violence and the aggression had been subdued, or he found no place for it to light, to stand, because his heart had began to let go and see through things. And so he comes in quite humble, and yet there's a central point that he's confused about, and that is on the bottom of page 94. He asks about these two concepts, really key concepts that come from the Mahaparinirvana text. But these concepts are throughout the Buddha's teaching. And they're basically about a fundamental polarity or dualism that not just Buddhists, but I would say most schools of thought and religions, and even people who aren't religious, who just trying to live their lives, get caught between. And it's really about this idea we wrestle with permanence and impermanence. That's how it's phrased here. And he says, I don't understand permanence and impermanence. Now, he's saying this in the context of a sutra text where it's described in fairly technical terms. But it's also just an underlying psychological condition or state that we all have. You know, the idea that we are born only to pass and die, and we don't really know what came before we were born, and we don't really know what's going to happen after we take our last breath. And so the idea that there's something lasting or permanent is really attractive to us, and yet at the same time, impermanence is always breathing down our necks, so to speak. And so it's a human problem. So that sometimes is referenced as permanence or impermanence, but also in the text you see it presented as existence and emptiness. It's polarized in a different way, talking about alive existence and then nothingness or emptiness as another way of contrasting it. In some of the teachings it's contrasted as eternalism, an idea that there is a permanent self, soul, or something that goes on immutably, unchanging forever. And then that's paired up against there's nothing whatsoever. When the lights go out, that's it. Nihilism. So you have permanence, impermanence, existence, emptiness, eternalism, nihilism. Sometimes it's contrasted in the Buddhist sense with samsara and nirvana. Samsara is the going on, the constant going on. Nirvana is the still quiescence of that's one way of rendering it. It's interesting too, in this one, in this text, he represented it with the concept of movement and stillness. So the movement is the active living principle, and stillness is represented as two ways. One is represented as real stillness, which isn't apart from movement, but generally sort of rendered as this kind of dull stillness. And he encourages his disciples not to use meditation to get this dull stillness, so that's contrasted with movement. And that's where he says, his famous line is, when you have this balance, you're everywhere engaged, but nowhere attached. That's the movement still. And he actually has a movement stillness verse that he gives, which is quite wonderful. And then I guess another way that I've seen it represented here, and it talks about in the Avatamsaka, is this dichotomy or polarization between worldly and world transcending. That there is the worldly common, which is associated with impermanence and flux and so forth, and then there's a world transcending, which is forever, unchanging, eternal. And the Avatamsaka is very clear. He said, in talking about this, he says those are just different words for a phenomena that isn't dual. And so when we wrestle with this, it's like, oh yeah, got it. No, not so easy. This is not easy to grasp, and he's having trouble with this. And the reason he's having trouble is not because he's a Buddhist or he's cultivating in this way. I would say it's just a universal human problem. What are we to make of this dichotomy, seeming dichotomy, that we're on the horns almost of two poles? And so he then, for the answer, the master pulls the rug on him, so to speak. And there you see it. The master says, impermanence is just the Buddha nature. And what is permanent is just a discriminating mind with all its good and bad states. Now, that is not the answer he was expecting, nor the answer that's usually given sort of in the text. And so now he's in a quandary, because on one hand, he thinks and knows that this is the patriarch who's speaking the true teaching. On the other hand, he seems to be contradicting the sutras. And he says that right out. He says, your explanation contradicts the sutras. And then the master says back to him, okay, well, I transmit the authentic mind seal of the Buddha. How could I say contradict it? Oops. And he says, but yeah, Zhi Cheng says, but the sutra says the Buddha nature is permanent, and you say it's impermanent. It says good and bad dharmas, even the aspiration for Bodhi, are impermanent, but you, the master, says they're permanent. You say you're not contradicting it, but it seems like you are, and but besides, now it's left me really confused. So he didn't get, like you're expecting, he hears it in like the earlier story, he says, oh, thank you, Great Master, you cleared it up for me. There's a pushing back. Now, you could say he's just getting even for the time he came to kill him, and there was that sort of thing. So like, take that now, you think you're smart. I don't know that that's the case. I think, based on the teachings and examples we've been given so far, this is probably the only way to break through Xinqiang state. In other words, the master is picking up a technique, a skillful means, a medicine that is precisely and particularly aimed at this individual. He won't be able to cause the breakthrough that's necessary other than bringing him to the edge of rational logic in his mind and where he's poised. And he wasn't expecting this. So let's go to the next page and follow this. And let's see if we can get through this tonight. Okay. The master said, in the past I heard the bhikshuni, this nun, Wu Jinzang, this takes place in the early part of the sutra, some of you remember, was reciting the Nirvana Sutra and I explained it for her with not so much as a single word or meaning out of accord with the sutra. So he's going back and saying, just to illustrate my point, I've been explaining, and particularly to this individual, and this individual asked, if you remember the exchange, how can you explain the sutra words and meaning if you're illiterate? And he answered her, he says, the words and meaning do not the meaning of the Buddha does not depend on words and language. And she immediately had a breakthrough. So he's kind of going back and maybe reminding him of this story, that maybe Xinshang is thinking, well, okay, I met my limits here. This isn't illiterate. He might have some spiritual abilities, but really he's not learned. He doesn't understand things. And probably I shouldn't be asking him these questions. It's beyond his capacity. And then he points to it, and Wu Jinsang was a very well-known and respected nun who was very learned and a sincere cultivator. So if she were moved and transformed by the master, then he has every reason to pause here and ask, well, it's not a bunch of dummies that are following this teacher. Some of these, and from the previous disciples, some are quite erudite and learned and so forth. And he says, and then my explanation now is exactly the same as I gave to her. Your student's capacity for understanding is shallow. This is him speaking now. Now he's saying the reverse. He's saying, well, if that's the case, and this is really profound, then my capacity is shallow. Please explain this for me in more detail. Now, you could take this, I suppose, as politeness. Him saying, well, my capacity is shallow. He doesn't really believe that. He's just sort of saying, okay, come on, give it to me. Or he might be honestly saying that. He might honestly be saying, wow, I don't doubt you, and I don't doubt that nun had that transformative moment where words and language were taken out of the equation as the underlying meaning, the ultimate underlying meaning, but it was something else other than that. And he's saying, I guess my capacity then isn't developed for me to get that yet. And so then the master goes on, he says, don't you realize if the Buddha nature were permanent, then what good or bad states would there be to speak of? And not a single person until the end of time would ever aspire to bodhi, to awakening. That is why I say it is impermanent. This is precisely the path to true permanence taught by the Buddha. Moreover, if all things were impermanent, then everything would have its own nature, which was subject to birth and death. And the truly permanent nature would not be universal, all-pervading. And that's why I say they are impermanent. And this is precisely what the Buddha meant by the teaching of permanence, true permanence. That cleared it up for everybody. Okay. Well, that's good. What else do you want to do tonight? Well, it probably didn't for him either. But let's try to unpack this a little bit. I can't guarantee we will, but let's go at it. What he seems to be saying here, I'm going to render this as both philosophical and psychological, but I'm stressing more this is psychological than philosophical. In other words, when he says, if you were to say the Buddha nature permanent, then he says psychologically, emotionally, not a single person would ever cultivate. The result would be no one would pick up the task of cultivating. That is why I say it's impermanent. In other words, I say it's impermanent as a stimulus or a prod to get you to cultivate and activate your essential nature. If I said everything was permanent, you'd say, well, there's no reason to do anything. It's already there, and I don't have to work on it, and I can just chill and relax. He says, on the other hand, if you say all things were impermanent, then everything would have its own nature subject to birth and death, and therefore there wouldn't be anything that was lasting or beyond this state. And they would all be subject to birth and death. And that truly permanent nature would not be. So now we got something here, another concept, the truly permanent nature. So what he's posing is, on a psychological, motivational level, he is trying to get somebody off either end of that spectrum of permanence or impermanence because they're cultivated dead ends. Either way you set up in one of those, you stop actually progressing. You don't make the movements to change and transform. One becomes a kind of a nihilistic emptiness, and the other one becomes a false eternity, neither of which are what he's saying is the true thing. So he's almost saying here, and this is not philosophical, but it's primarily psychological, because you look at his language here, no one would do this, everyone, and then he's saying that is why. That is why it's spoken in this way. And he says, that is why I say, and that's precisely what the Buddha meant by teaching true permanence. So now we kind of have to go back and maybe look at this a little more closely, because he's referencing Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who in this particular time period becomes the seeker of this truth. He becomes the embodiment. And the text here is very clear that he's not the only one. From limitless time, there seems to have been individuals who pursued this to its final understanding, Buddhahood or nirvana. And this is an ongoing, recurring pattern or path. So, but he's saying in particular, probably talking about the Buddha, we could say this is what a Buddha meant. You don't have to do the Buddha. So if we go back, we look at what was this experience, what was the awakening experience of a Buddha or the Buddha. And very quickly, the Buddha began to wrestle with these two polarities, these two dichotomies, however you want to pose them: permanence, impermanence, eternalism, nihilism, born only to die. And this was the driving question of what am I to make of this? How am I to solve this riddle? And it wasn't just a kind of Sunday New York Times riddle that you play with. It's an existential, deep human riddle. And so he was trying to figure this out. And he came to a very radical and paradoxical conclusion. He basically said, this is like, in modern language, a paradigm paralysis. Once you're caught in the paradigm of these two, it's an either or. It's an either or. It's either one or the other. That's where your thinking and your emotions go. And he says, so what everybody is afraid of is impermanence, is the end of existence, is the turning off of the lights. And though they're afraid of it, they can't avoid it. And on the other hand, what they want is eternal, life and existence and so forth and transcendence, and they're fond of that, but they can't obtain it. So on one hand, what you're afraid of, you can't avoid, and what as humans we are most fond of, we can't obtain, because that permanent, unchanging, eternal state is nowhere to be found. I mean, you just look, and this is one of the contemplations people do in their beginning meditation. Ask the question, what is there in my experience, in my human experience, day to day, week to week, time to time, that is unchanging, never moving, is immutable and whatnot? And it becomes a kind of a hopeless pursuit, because everything, and we talked about this last week, but then what can I grab onto that isn't changing and immutable because I really want it, and it's just elusive. It can't be got. And so the deeper psychological angst that comes when stuck in this paradigm is being caught between the fondness and the fear. And what the Buddha did, which was a radical, he somehow did a paradigm shift out of that and said, if one stopped that kind of thinking and that kind of longing and that kind of fearing and put that to rest, and just kept putting down and letting go what did not match either permanence or impermanence in terms of fond or fear, what would happen? And he had, it's incredible. It's not only a faith or a confidence that this is worth and could be pursued, but a courage. Because this takes it takes a lot of courage to go into this realm and ask yourself, if I just keep letting go of what is not lasting, permanent, true, and whatnot, without being taken over by the fear of there's nothing whatsoever. And what he discovered in this process was that when he absolutely let that mad mind of grasping, attaching, rejecting, fearing, when he let that go, it wasn't nothingness whatsoever. It wasn't anything he feared, nor was anything he imagined he was going to get. But it was a state he called nirvana, which was the end of the unsatisfactory paradigm paralysis of this. And he called that nirvana. And he said, well, just like the Sixth Patriarch, how unexpected, how far out, this is really incredible. I've had it all along, I didn't realize it, and there's nothing to attain, but that isn't the end, and da-da-da-da-da, and he says, I just call it nirvana. He said, it isn't the end of existence, it's the end of the problem of existence. So existence doesn't end. That's part of the paradigm paralysis. It ceases to be dukkha. It ceases to be unsatisfactory. And so when he had this realization, he said, whoa, this truth, if you want to call it that, or this insight into the nature of reality and what this is all about, is inexpressible in words. And everybody has that potential experience, replete, waiting to be activated with him. And he said, only because of two things do we not actually replicate what he did. And he's not laughing or mocking, he's saying, these are very tough. It's because the grasping, attaching, the wanting is so powerful that we can never get free of that fondness. And the fear of nothing whatsoever, which he called, a deluded thinking. So the attachments and the deluded thinking that was posited on the paradigm core, which is self, couldn't be let go of. And as long as those two couldn't be let go of, no one could break through. No one could get out of the cocoon that we spun ourselves into. This is very interesting. So when he had that experience, and it was an experience in the sense that it wasn't an intellectual insight or idea, but it was a visceral, total mind-body letting go and liberation, and finally he called it freedom, liberation in the highest sense. He had actually broken through whatever the chains of this kind of dilemma are. And then, I'm doing this because I'm trying to go back to what happened. At that point, the texts say he hesitated to do anything. Now you would think, I'm going to share this with the world. I might get a Nobel Prize for this or something. But he didn't. And the reason he didn't is, I think, and you can infer this by reading the text, is that experience is so difficult to replicate, so difficult to transmit to people, to take this up, that you'd be hitting your head against the wall, and you'd meet with incredible resistance. If you say there is a state that is neither earth, air, fire, nor water, that isn't this world or another world, that isn't this body or no body or other bodies, I simply call it the end of suffering. Most people say, oh yeah, sure, let's go for it. It's advertised on TV. Send in your Visa card for $250, you can get. Nobody's going to, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense, he said, because the ego's locked in its own cocoon or paradigm. And that's why, he said, so therefore the only way someone gets it is if they get outside the cocoon of the paradigm paralysis. And he said, but that's like almost impossible, because human nature in its unawakened state is almost essentially a grasping thing. It's grasping. The fundamental, what I really want to talk about, what makes us humans, is I'm just doing this with my hands. But, that's what we do. We grab, we grasp, we want, we crave. We're constantly grasping everywhere and everything we can get our gloms on. And even when we can't get our hands on, we're storing someplace. So we grasp and put it in storage to keep it, even though we can't hold it immediately. So we accumulate things in storage facilities, and then we put our money in investment portfolios and everything, because but it's all, the world is run by grasping, grasping, grasping. The time the baby comes out, those of you who work with babies aren't like, they're grasping, grasping, grasping all the time. Till the moment we die. And even in the moment of dying, we're still grasping. We're still trying to hold on. As Dylan Thomas says, rage, rage against the dying light, right? That's a human potential. So the Buddha is saying, so deep is this habitual tendency, driven, he said, by avidya, by misunderstanding. But it's a misunderstanding so powerful that it's almost impossible for living beings to break out. And, I mean, you kind of think, how did he do it? So when you read his life story, especially if you read Ashvaghosha's Buddhacharita, you can see it was with immense energy and effort against all forms of support. His parents didn't support him. The culture didn't support him. The religious authorities didn't support him. His friends didn't support him. His wife didn't support him. Nobody supported him. They all thought he was crazy. Or, at best, doing something totally futile and a waste of his young life. Now, you could say either he had courage or he was just stubborn, but he did not. Something in him said, this can be done, and if it can't be done, I want to know because I tried. I don't want to stop because someone told me it can't be done. So he went, and he just let go, and he let go. And when he finally let go of any last thing, he basically said, when that mind stopped, the grasping, wanting mind, that very stopping of that was awakening. It wasn't like it stopped and then I got awakening. See, this is the thing we have to think. It was the very stopping of it was the awakening. In other words, the ceasing of that grasping was itself the solution. And that's why he said, how strange and unexpected, because I had that with me. It wasn't I had to go to some mountain or some teacher. In fact, that would be contrary, because you're still getting, it's the letting go. So we just had a Chan retreat with our students at the city, and I quoted one of the verses my teacher used to start one of the meditation Chan retreats to sort of get us into this paradigm shift. And it's simply in English, it was, living beings grasping everywhere, cover over the wonderful. Let go, release your hold, the wonderful revealed. And that was the contemplation we used, and sort of when you're meditating, what you're looking at is every impulse, every urge to grasp, to attach, including fear. You simply don't move for it. You just simply let it be, let it go, let it go, let it go. And eventually, things start calming and quieting until, apparently, with discipline and practice, you can reach a point where there isn't any urge anymore to do that. And then you go, how unexpected. But, you know, this is where the Buddha got to in his experience. Now, the text, it says in the Buddhacharita, he then didn't want to teach. He hesitated to teach. I don't think because he didn't care, he wasn't compassionate. He just thought, this isn't going to work. I'm going to convey this. And then it said, I think, was it one of a deva came? Who was it? A Brahma king, which is a deva, a god. Because this was interesting to the gods. You think, well, the gods got... No, the Buddha was saying the gods, although it's really pleasant and plush, that too comes to an end. And so they know, they're aware that they have a longer span. For us, we look like fruit flies to them. You know, our life and existence is like they're looking down and saying, look at the fruit flies. They came in the morning, they're gone in the afternoon. That's it. They're born, they eat a few things, they procreate, and they're gone. And they're going, whoa, that was fast. For them, their span and their enjoyment sphere is much longer, but they're also cognizant of its passing. So they know they too are burning the candle. Maybe at a slower pace than ours, maybe a little brighter than ours, but it's still burning. And so they're interested in getting out of this dilemma, even though it's much prolonged. The Deva asks him to teach, and the Buddha still resists. And then, according to the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha has an insight. Or the text is he recalls that in the past, in this line of Buddhas, there is this thing called upaya, Fangbian in Chinese. And what that means, it means translated as skill and means. In other words, through expedient devices, one could begin to teach living beings, not giving them that ultimate teaching quite yet, and realizing that even giving it could be disastrous if it's not introduced at the right time, and further realizing it can't be given. See, this was the other dilemma. He couldn't just write it down and say, here's the, and put, even if he wrote it on stone and gave it to us, we'd all be going, what? I don't get it. Just let go of what? It doesn't make sense, and we'd throw it away. So he had two issues he had to wrestle with. One, it could not be explained or put into words or language because words and language are constructions of the dualism to begin with. And it had to be therefore experienced. And then moreover, he had to deal with the paradigm paralysis of fear of losing and wanting to get that was so deep in people. And so these two were countered in a sense or addressed with upaya. Upaya meant that he could skillfully lead a person from a place of total confusion to a little more understanding, a little more happiness, a little more liberation, and they would feel the joy that came from that. And from that ground, he could then create another platform and yet another platform. Sometimes they compared it to the ascent of a mountain, that at the beginning, you know, you get everybody and they just make it to that first lake 1.5 miles in, and they, oh, that was really hard. You know, okay, let's have, you know, s'mores and, you know, have a fire and tell stories. And you wake up in the morning and the Buddha says, oh my gosh, look, I hear there's another lake up there that's really, you know, much better than this, and the s'mores are a lot better there and whatnot. Really? Well, you didn't lie. Look, and then they go on, and he calls it inducements to practice, inducements, and he leads them on. And this is where the Lotus Sutra talks about this progression until eventually he can get them to the point where they've had so many positive experiences, so much liberation and joy from letting go, letting go, letting go. It wasn't like they were letting go with the idea that sometime when they died they'd get reward. They were getting immediate rewards. Pretty neat stuff. I'm not talking about cars and toys. I'm talking about really psychological, emotional joy and liberation that they were experiencing on this. And they kept thinking, okay, we're here now, right? Say, yeah. And then the morning would come, equivalent, say, well, we're not really here yet. And so their faith was rewarded by understanding, which produced more confidence and trust, which produced more understanding. So but it wasn't a given. There was a dialogue going on here, back and forth as he led them on. And so he came up with this, and knowing that they were wanting permanence in nirvana, he promised that they could have that. But then when they got a version of that, which was pretty cool, he said it's still not the ultimate. You still have to let go of even wanting or clinging to this to get the true thing. And that's where the dilemma takes place in the Lotus Sutra, because they're going, ooh, wait a minute now. Because now we're a little scared. You're saying there's nothing to get, and that's good. Now, I know up to this point, getting less and less was good, but now I got my nirvana that you promised me, and you're telling me I got to let go of that too? And yeah, this is where the upaya ends and the deep underlying meaning starts to emerge. But the point is, at that point, they were able, many of them were able to take that next step into what appeared to be the unknown, the final letting go and release, and the wonderful then became revealed. So what Hui Neng is saying here in this passage, if I could, I think it's similar to that. If you take this as teaching them that everything was permanent, then they wouldn't aspire. If you tell them it's impermanent, then there'd be nothing to get. There'd be no release. There'd just be this complete, flux of empty phenomena rolling on. So then he goes on to explain, he says, ordinary people and seekers outside the way cling to misguided ideas of permanence, while those who follow the path of the two vehicles mistake what is permanent as impermanent, and from this formulate 8 wrong views. Because of this, the Buddha gave the complete teachings of the Nirvana Sutra to refute these biased views and explain clearly true permanence, true bliss, true self, and true purity. Now you are overly dependent on words and missing the meaning. This is a great line. and thus end up misunderstanding the Buddha's sublime, complete final statement as if he meant nihilistic impermanence or a lifeless permanence. And even if you read the sutra 1,000 times, what benefit would you get from it? So now he gives him the key to understanding this. He said, you have to understand the talk of permanence, impermanence, back and forth. The Buddha was just using the conventional language of people's conventional thinking to be able to talk to them. At the same time, he had to move them out of that attachment to those ideas, but he couldn't move them out by denying these things, so he used that language. And by the way, this is the language, of the time that most religious seekers were concerned with, these issues. We may not be so much now, but it's still deep in the human condition. So he had to talk in this way. But now what he's saying is very interesting. He said, but you mistake the words for the meaning. So this goes back to, so the Buddha had to use upaya, words and language, that, as Chan says, like fingers pointing to the moon, because without, you'd say, where's the moon? And you have to point and say it's up there, but not mistaking the finger pointing to the moon for the moon. So this is the Chan expression. So what you're doing is you're aiming at this, but don't mistake the end for the aim or the way you get to it. So he says you're missing the meaning overly dependent on words, because words are only meant to break your attachment to this seeking, this craving, and this fearing, to get you to a point where you could have this direct experience. And otherwise, you'll end up either in a nihilistic impermanence or a lifeless permanence, because you're polarizing it again. Even at the level of, when he says the two vehicles, even at the level of religious, spiritual understandings of permanence and so forth. Either one of those is a dead end. It's still part of the paralysis. And he said, therefore, you're now, so he's saying if you read it 1,000 times, you won't get benefit. What's the change? What would he have to do then? Besides, if he's saying the reading, you're not going to read it more and more and get the answer to what's holding you up. So where does the answer lie? This is the question. He's almost saying as if you've read it enough. And it doesn't mean just reading it. You recited it enough. You've studied it enough. So where would the focus of his attention go then? Because he's saying you're dependent on words and missing meaning. How is he to get the meaning then? Because the words obviously aren't serving that purpose now. They're actually holding him back. Anybody? Or is it not there? Is it implied but not said explicitly? What is he hinting at him to go after, to pursue?
Let the words guide him rather than dissecting and analyzing them.
Okay, and where would they guide him? How would they guide him? What would they guide him to? For example, let me go back and say, when the Buddha then gives his first teaching, what are called, some people say, the turning of the Dharma wheel, the Four Noble Truths, there is this unsatisfactoriness, there's a cause of it, there's an end to it, and there's a way to end it. This is the formula. And then there was 3 turnings, and the first turning says, I have experiences, I've done this. The second turning is, you should try it, you should do it. And the third turning is, and then you should know and only when you know for yourself can you affirm everything else about it. So it's the knowing for yourself that I think he's being directed. I think he's directing to the third turning here, which is, I've said it, and I've encouraged you. Well, that's the words, and that's the teaching. But now he's got to go to the experiential. He's got to go to the direct encounter, the direct knowledge of it. And how is that to be done?
By giving up the pursuit of it?
No, he was very astute. Those who didn't hear his answer, by giving up the pursuit of it. Ironically, I think that's where he doesn't tell him, because he's cultivated the asceticism, he's cultivated the precepts, he's done the meditation and everything. So his cultivation and his study is very rich and very deep, and yet he's still not penetrated into the heart of the watermelon. He's still on the rind. That's another metaphor that means you're the ant on the rind on the outside of the watermelon, knowing there's some sweetness there, but you can't get through to it. So how do you get through past the rind? It's really interesting, because if we turn the page, let's just do that. Xin Chang suddenly experienced a great awakening. Now, I know you all did tonight too. But what happened? Why, when we leave it at that point, he says you're clinging to the words, you're missing the meaning, and if you don't, you'll think the final statement is some kind of nihilistic nothingness or a lifeless eternity. And then he has an awakening. What caused this? So, or maybe he hit him on the head with his cane, boom. Anybody want to?
Don't have words for that.
What happened? What happened?
Well, I assume the expedient tools that were being applied to them worked. But it's somewhat of a mystery to me how it worked.
Yeah. But I think your point may be well taken, that maybe he kind of knew he was caught in a kind of rigorous asceticism and an intellectualization, and he was ready to be encouraged to let go of that. Because his whole experience has been letting go, letting go, letting go, and now he's at this last point. And sometimes if you have a great teacher with virtue, where you can't get yourself to do it, they can encourage you. They can, just with a smile say, so, let it go. And all of a sudden something happens that wouldn't happen if you're, I don't know. Obviously, though, we have to understand that there was something there in their relationship, in the master's virtue and his demeanor and his poise and his energy of compassion and whatnot, and then his eagerness, and almost at the point where he was almost ready, but he just needed maybe a little encouragement to say, maybe that's it. Anyhow, after which, to promise I'm going to finish it tonight, so let's see if I can finish it. He gave his verse of awakening. And this is his summary of it. He says, for those who clung to impermanence, the Buddha taught there is permanence. In other words, clinging to the impermanence, the fear of nothing whatsoever, the Buddha gave encouraging, hopeful things of saying, no, there's something beyond impermanence and nothingness. Otherwise, psychologically, you'd fall into despair and you'd give up. On the other hand, it seems to say, you could say for those who were clinging to permanence, the Buddha then taught impermanence. To break that, because then the permanence became mine. I got it, mine. And they're still in the paradigm. And in fact, once you have that, you know it's not yours. See, this is the funny thing. You say it's mine, but you know it's not, because you don't last. So for it to be yours, you'd have to presume that you last to enjoy this. But in fact, everything about our experience says we don't last. Yes, but in my imagination, I imagine myself going off after death and being, it's all imagination, okay? There's nothing in your experience that confirms that. Now, you could call it faith or you call it delusion, whatever you want to call it. There's nothing in your experience that confirms it. So, and not understanding, this is beautiful, not understanding how expedience, upaya, and in Pali there's a term also called pariyaya. Upaya has to do with this idea of adapting the teachings to the potentials, the capacities, the doubts, the prejudices, the biases of the individual. That's upaya. So you accommodate them so you can make them understand that. Pariyaya means literally roundabout teaching, that you avoid literal teaching because that sets up philosophical rigidity. This is the truth. You teach figuratively through metaphor, analogies, similes, stories, parables. That's pariyaya. And so a lot of the misunderstanding of the Buddha's teachings, I would say, have to do with people taking pariyaya as ultimate, the teaching. And the Buddha was really just trying to get a point across to let you let go of something so that you could move rather than to give you something orthodoxly or dogmatically to hang on to. So and some people just said, they're just stories. They're not. They're actually very powerful medicine, but they were meant to catalyze the letting go transformation rather than the grabbing on intellectualization. So that's why pariyaya and upaya became the two tools the Buddha used most of all. And that's what he says. That's how I didn't understand how expedience works. And he says, I was just picking up pebbles from a spring pond, but now without expending any effort. See, that goes back. Without any effort, the Buddha nature appears right before me. The master did not bestow it. That's really a great line. And I did not obtain a single thing. He's got it. I mean, he's got, not got. He's got not getting anything. That's like at the end of the Heart Sutra, it starts with the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara was cultivating, really working on this wisdom thing, this wisdom riddle, and illuminated and saw. Didn't just see intellectually, illuminated and saw. So brought this light of spiritual cultivation and saw that the self and what belongs to the self, this whole game is empty. And then it says, he crossed beyond, or she crossed beyond all suffering and difficulty. Whoa, he got it. Okay, then at the end it says, it goes through, there's nothing to get, nothing to, da, 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 da. And when the Bodhisattva realized there's nothing to attain, it says, there's no knowing attaining. And because there's nothing to get, nothing to grasp, nothing to attain, the Bodhisattva, through reliance on wisdom, is unimpeded in the mind. The heart is completely unimpeded and unafraid, and leaves distorted dream thinking far behind. And it's the unafraid. See, it's not like there's nothing to get, nothing to attain. Get the heebie-jeebie. No, it's like there's nothing to attain, leaves fear behind, and nirvana. So this is what the text is rendering. You can't get this by, you can read the Heart Sutra thousands of times. You won't get, somehow something happens when you do that final letting go that goes, ah! And until you go, I want prajna, I want bodhi, you're not going to get it. So I think you're close to the something that in understanding just that much, he broke through. So picking up pebbles from a spring pond, I'm going to try at that. I'm not sure I can do that, but I like poetry, and I find this one interesting. Generally, Chan has a lot of metaphors and stories, and this is one literary allusion that's used for kind of, you're rushing around in search for a spiritual jewel, usually called the pearl. You're rushing around in search for that while actually having been in possession of it from the very beginning. And so you're searching. The spring pond sometimes refers to the joy or the coolness of nirvana. And picking up the pebbles is this almost, it's kind of alluding to this aimless search for pearls among the shore pebbles. So you're going, you know, have you ever done this as a kid? You go to the ocean and whatnot, and you go, ooh, 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 that one's, ooh, ooh, when you bring them all home and they dry out and they look just like gravel, right? And when I got them, especially when I was a kid, I thought, oh, this is a pearl, this is gold, this is jade. And it's just stones with different colors. So I think it's referring to that. But it's also beautiful in the sense, no, it's a sense of when he's saying, I was just picking up pebbles from a spring pond. He was right at the cusp, right at the place of nirvana. But instead of the pearl, he was picking up the pebbles. And the irony of this is the pearl was within all the time. It wasn't in the pebbles. And I think that's why he's saying the master did not bestow it, and I did not get a single thing. And I know I'm going to push this a little bit, so you can jump on me if you want. But where do pearls come from? Now, don't say the jewelry store, and don't do that. Or a pearl machine. Huh?
Irritation of oysters.
They come from an oyster. So when if you have an oyster, which looks on the outside like nothing, right? But inside is the body of the oyster. And when there's an irritant, usually, proverbially, it's a grain of sand, but it could be a fungus or anything like that. Once that irritant gets in there, it works its way into the oyster. The defense mechanism, or I would say the awakening mechanism, to use the metaphor, is a release of this fluid. I think it's called nacre, N-A-C-R-E, nacre, or nacra. And it releases this to isolate or to coat the irritant so it becomes less irritating. And layer upon layer of this is then deposited until you get this lustrous pearl. So it's really interesting to me. It's like Fanna Joshir Puti. The Fanna, the afflictions are the sand, the irritant. But in our response to it, by working on it, releasing this, cultivation of this then it turns into a pearl. And so I know you can say, well, now don't push the metaphor too far. I'm just having fun saying it does work in the sense that, and often you don't see the pearl because it's in the clamp, so it's not like it's shining bright like the pebbles. It's actually hidden away, and yet it's the real thing, whereas the pebbles are there, but they're not the real thing. The more of the pearl is a cultivated, I guess they call them cultivated. They're cultivated by the actual clam or oyster itself in the process of responding to the irritant. And it's almost like you could say our meditation, if you say our meditation practice, we're releasing nacre. We're just sitting here and releasing nacre. Slowly, each sit, release a little more nacre, a little more nacre. And finally, the irritant is transformed into a pearl. And it doesn't happen necessarily automatically. But anyhow, so I promised I'd finish. I did, more or less, for this section. And I hope I was trying to frame it in the larger tradition where it wasn't just Hui Neng's use of this. This seems to be the preferred teaching pattern by necessity of all Buddhas, which is you cannot directly go to this with anybody because the problem is so ingrained and so caught up in our very structures of our being that we have to be, if you want to use the word, tricked or led step by step away from it because it's so powerful is the resistance to this letting go. So that's it for tonight. We'll pick up, who's next? Who's Shen Hui? That's the little boy. This is going to be fun. So now we go to Shen Hui, who is a mischievous, what we call a gate kid, gifted and talented, whatever, right? So, any announcements to be made? Everybody's gone. The city, 10,000 Buddhas, is still doing their Chan session, right? Guanyin. Oh, I'm sorry, Guanyin session. You just came back. Yes. Was going strong? I mean, if you can say that for a session, I don't know if that's the right language. A session's going strong, but it seemed like there was good energy up this week. We had a mini Chan session and the Guanyin simultaneously, and it was really quite touching for me to see all the students just drop all their studies and books, and for 3 days immerse themselves in the wordless, signless, markless path of Chan. There were struggles, there was probably insights and growth and all sorts of things happening, but there's a saying in the Dharma that after you read 10,000 books, you should walk 10,000 miles. And I sort of calculated the number of minutes that everybody said in Chan this week, and then said it turned out to be about 1,000 minutes. And they said after reading 1,000 pages, you should sit 1,000 minutes as equivalent. But the other thing it did by practicing together, undergraduates, graduates, faculty, staff, even the president of the university, people from the board, practicing together, really leveled and brought a community together. And nobody talked. Everybody kept a vow of silence. So what brought them together was this shared practice and just mutually supporting each other. And then Dharma Master Hung Chur and I gave the talks, which was kind of fun because we seldom work together. We go back to the late 60s, early 70s. So it's really fun to sit down to somebody you've kind of known but not known. In our paths have gone this, and then getting back together again to do that. So it was a good time. They're like, we should do this again. Anyhow, I guess the announcement should be tomorrow night. There should be a Dharma assembly here for the Avatamsaka, or a light.
Reverend Misha will lecture from Australia.
Okay, he's Skyping in from Australia. And then anything coming up?
Sunday, there's a Buddha recitation.
Oh, here?
7:30 to 4:30.
Okay.
One day.
Okay. What I would encourage you all, though, to think about is, let me cross. Although he had this realization seemingly in a moment, wow, it's easy to forget the amount of effort and work that went into getting him to that point. He'd been sitting for a long time, every day sitting. He had been cultivating precepts diligently. He had been studying diligently. And that was not an obstacle. That was actually got him to the point where this one teaching then could result in something like that. It's easy to think, if I just go knocking on the right doors, eventually I'll get some teacher who's going to do that for me, without thinking you won't even find the teacher unless you do the groundwork prep first. And then even if you don't want to, the teacher will manifest. So it's sort of like every day having some kind of diligent practice as a ground to keep building on is really important. Because all these breakthroughs are not necessarily moment breakthroughs, but the result of a lifetime of effort and sincerity. So practice, practice. Okay, we'll do the transference in English. Our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the Triple Jewel.